Okay, so thanks. My name is Lueder. I'm here to talk to you about how to find the order in chaos when you're dealing with incidents. So a little bit about me. I am a Google SRE program manager. I work on what we call the BreakFix programs, which means we try to break things and we also try to fix things. That includes programs like our disaster recovery testing program, incident management program, which I'll be talking about, as well as some data integrity programs. Before I came to Google a couple of years ago, I worked mainly in wireless software and software companies, and was a software engineer, systems engineer, and project manager. Okay, so I was actually here last year. I don't know if any of you saw my talk last year. I'm not going to go over everything I talked about then. I'm going to try and give you guys a bit of an update. So, you know, the summary of that was I had been doing quite a bit of manual incident analysis and found that there was quite a wealth of information within that data set. And people became very interested in what the data had to say. And so I thought I'd come back this year and talk a little bit about the lessons learned and what we've put in place since then. And maybe you guys can take a few things away from that. So some of the lessons we learned. So the manual analysis that I had been doing was very difficult, labor intensive, but also extremely valuable. So a lot of teams and managers and even SREs themselves were really interested to see what the data told them about how their service was doing. But the other thing we learned was that the only way that this initiative could scale was if we crowdsourced the information, basically asking the teams themselves to capture and collect this information for us so that we could do this analysis. And we also learned that using effective tools would actually break down any resistance that an SRE or someone writing a postmortem might have to collecting this information for us. So when I talk about chaos and incident management, this is a bit of what I was reading when I was reading many postmortems at Google. So it can be quite a bit of information to process and sort of try and figure out, okay, what do I care most about within this sort of array of information? It can be very chaotic, and I've read quite a few postmortems, and that's where a lot of these quotes actually come from. So as people are managing their incident, they're talking amongst themselves and trying to figure out, okay, what's going on? There was a talk earlier about incident commander roles, and I mean, there is just a lot going on. So how do you figure out what you care most about when you're looking at something like this? So I thought I'd talk today about what is the most critical bits of information that we capture from incidents. And this is kind of a sample, but it might give you a sense of what we're looking at. So I thought I'd start with our timing data. So last year I talked about our timeline. So when you look at any given incident, there's pretty much a set timeline that you're looking at. So starts with a root cause down here at the bottom, right? So someone checks in, something bad, they send out a config file, it's going to break production, we just know it. Sometime later, that bad thing enters production. We call that our trigger. And at that point, we capture the start time. Next, we ask ourselves, when did we detect it? When did someone at Google know that this problem was happening? We ask ourselves, okay, when did we escalate the issue? When did we engage our incident management protocols? When did we mitigate the impacts to our users? And when did we fully resolve the incident? And that allows us to capture overall duration, time to detect, time to resolve. And in addition, we also capture when did we fully understand the impact and when did we fully understand the root cause. Those two bits of information are actually pretty important to understand how transparent your systems are, right? If it takes you a long time to understand the impact when something's broken way down in your stack, that's maybe not a good sign, and maybe you need to design some improvements to your visibility so that you know that. In addition to the timeline data, we also capture what I'm calling incident metadata. So I talked last year about the kind of root cause categories that we collect. These are things like capacity management problems, deployment problems, software. Do we have interface issues between two components, and that's causing a problem? I mentioned trigger. We also have a series of trigger categories. These are things like a configuration push, a binary push. Sometimes our users' behavior themselves can trigger an issue. We also look at different aspects of severity. So we've actually categorized what impacts an incident can have on our systems along several severity dimensions. We also ask ourselves, how did we detect this? Did we detect this through monitoring? Did we detect this because a customer told us about it? Or was there some manual inspection involved? And then last, we also defined a list of incident anti-patterns. These are behaviors that we observe within that incident management timeline that we want to capture so that we can look for any systemic problems in how we manage our incidents. So I mentioned tools earlier. So I think having a good tool chain in place will help break down resistance to capturing this information. So first, we do have an incident management tool, and that tool is one of the most important things it does is actually generates that first draft of the postmortem. So we're actually capturing data that will help us understand what happened throughout, and then we use that information and generate a postmortem. Then we have several tools available to help write that postmortem. We capture a very detailed timeline, and we ask the author of that postmortem to tag their timeline with these key bits of information that we collect later. And then we also have a tool to help us catalog and do analysis across all of the postmortems. So we've been able to unlock a lot of data by doing this, and these are real charts. I'm not allowed to share much information about it, but we can look for seasonal trends in how long it takes us to resolve incidents, detect incidents, how many incidents we're having. Naturally, when we have the holiday times, we have less change going on, so we see less incidents. We're also able to just look across all of those bits of data that I explained earlier and sort of ask ourselves, okay, how are we doing as an organization? And at Google, there are so many services. And actually, I do this analysis across pretty much every service at Google, and that includes anything from Google Fiber to Gmail to our ads products. So everything really is collected here. It's actually pretty fantastic. So, looking beyond where we're at now, so what we do with this data is we're actually looking at how can we fix these systemic issues that we find. So if the data is revealing that we have a certain problem with binary pushes, right? So we're pushing our binaries too fast and we're not able to mitigate the impacts of an incident, this data will actually help us institute improvements to how we do things. So we also look to correlate improvements in the data with the improvements that we put in place, right? So if we're actually instituting a new process for managing these binary pushes, is it actually having the desired effect that we want? So we're using that data to show at least a correlation, and we're also introducing additional statistical rigor in our systems so that we can look for causation. We're also automating and driving down the effort to collect this data through the tool chain I mentioned earlier. And I'm not the only one doing this analysis. Now I'm working on training other teams on how to do this, how to use the tools, and letting them request improvements to how we capture our information so that they can do the analysis that's most relevant to them and their team. So the final thoughts. So first, I did originally have to convince people to capture this additional information. But it doesn't have to mean extra busy work for the incident commander, the person who's writing that postmortem, especially if you make it easy for them to just tag it in the timeline. They're already asked to write that timeline, so just have them put an additional tag in there. Also, having those tools collect the logs for them, IRC logs, that sort of thing, gives them very little argument against collecting this information. If I had to start with just 5 things that were the most important and most revealing about how well we're doing with incident management, it would be these. So the start time, the end time, when it was detected, how is this bad situation getting into production, and then what are your root cause categories. And what's interesting about root cause categories, it actually gives you something very interesting to share with your dev teams, because you can actually tell them, hey, you know, we've got some software interface issues. Maybe you guys could expand your integration testing before it gets into production. So you don't need to have real fancy tools. We've been slowly improving and upgrading our tools as we go along. But in the early days, I just had sheets and some docs, and that was it. And I was able to do quite a bit and really show people the value of this data, even with very simplistic tools. And if you're advanced enough, you can actually use this data to start correlating to your features that are launching, maybe service atrophy, meaning the service isn't keeping up with the latest and greatest, it's not using the latest features available in infrastructure. So when you have this data, you can actually start looking at these trends over time and use that data to make your entire system more robust. And that's it. And I'd like to open it up to any questions.
So I'm sure there's a lot of things that go bump in the night at Google,
Yeah.
And you can't possibly do a postmortem for everything that goes wrong. So how do you prioritize and decide what is considered an incident and what isn't, and what you get this data on?
Yeah, so we do have a pretty consistent postmortem culture. So we write postmortems for most, certainly anything that the user sees. We also use that severity flagging system to tell us, is a postmortem warranted? So that would include like a near miss, or any kind of cascading failure will generate a postmortem. And I'll mention in the SRE book that's being released this week, there's actually a section that I helped author on postmortem culture, as well as a sample postmortem at the end of the book. So you can kind of see some examples there. Each organization needs to decide what that threshold is based on how much they care, how risk tolerant they are. Right? So if you don't write a postmortem for something, it means you're willing to have that happen again, and your management chain is, they're like, okay, that's all right, I can live with that. Not every organization, yeah, so go ahead, yes.
You mentioned characterizing severity across several dimensions. Can you elaborate on what those might be?
Yeah, definitely. I talked about this last year, and so if you want to hear all the details, the talk was recorded. We have any financial impacts, any user impacts, user-facing impacts. Was user trust violated in some way? We'll look at bad press. Did we receive any bad press due to this incident? We look at cascading failure. We look at service criticality. So how critical is this service to Google products? Alphabet products, actually, to be honest. Let's see, what else? We look internally as well, so how did something affect Googlers internally? We have quite a bit of infrastructure internally, so that's included. And in a lot of cases, we actually do boil that up into something I call simple severity, which is like severity 0, 1, 2, through 4. But it's actually really interesting to look a lot along those dimensions and sort of put yourself in different shoes, right? If you're in the financial, if you're a finance guy, you're going to care, okay, when did we impact our revenue stream, something like that. Yeah.
Can you share a little bit more details about the tools that you mentioned? Like you said, 3 tools. One is to start, that creates a template. Is that using your chat?
Yeah, so we have a tool internal to Google that is used for managing an incident while it's in progress. One of the earlier talks, they actually had a tool as well, and I know Facebook has a tool. So a lot of organizations have put in place their own tool to manage this process internally. We have something as well. What it's nice about it is that it hooks into our email system and to our IRC system, and so you can actually link these things together. That way, at the end of the day, you capture who's talking to who. It keeps track of roles, any additional resources associated with that incident. And so it basically collects everything together. Unfortunately, it's not available to the world yet. Maybe one day we'll release it. The second phase is actually something that I personally worked on, which is our postmortem templates and some automation that I wrote for the postmortem template that basically uses our AppScript infrastructure. I don't know if anyone's familiar with AppScript, but it's basically a programming language built into our Google Apps infrastructure, right? So you can work with Sheets and Docs, and I wrote quite a bit of script myself to actually process the data coming out of the postmortem. And then the final tool is again something that we've built internally that collects all of these documents together, but since everything's in sort of a structured form, you can actually pull in all of the data you want, including all these timestamps and do measurements and say, okay, what was our median duration for incidents of this nature versus incidents of this nature? And yeah, so it pulls all that together. Unfortunately, they're not available to the public yet, but
yeah, maybe someday. Thank you.
maybe someday, yeah.
You talked about tagging by the incident commanders. Can you just tell in what way?
Absolutely. Yeah, so when you're going through an incident and you are capturing something in the timeline and the log, you will indicate this is when the incident started, this is when the incident was detected, this is when the incident was over. For the three most important things. And so you're just tagging it so that later when you're doing this analysis, it could be a month later, 6 months later, you have all that information captured and no one has to go back through and sort of replay what happened in their mind because they're actually capturing it as they go along.
What sort of expectations do you have around time past the incident for a postmortem to be authored? And I don't know if you hold review meetings or anything like that.
Yeah, there's certain teams will institute a SLO for postmortem completion. And that can range, it actually depends on the severity of the incident. And in some cases, we have a responsibility to communicate to our customers as well what went on, especially in our cloud services. You know, they look to us to tell them what happened. And so we'll have a SLO for postmortem completion, and then there'll be additional requirements for how long action items must be closed.
We review and score all of our postmortems, PIRs. How do you ensure quality throughout this whole process? So you write something down, it might not be correct though, or might not have enough detail. How do you ensure quality throughout the process?
Yeah, you mean the quality of the data that they're capturing? Well, we do have a review process for postmortems, and this actually brings up an interesting challenge. So we've had to train people, and at Google, there's potentially thousands of people who could be writing and collaborating on a postmortem just because there's so many people and so many services. So we have a training program that we'll put people through, and we'll say, okay, you have to take training on how to write the postmortem. However, my personal opinion is that training only goes so far. I mean, if you have someone like me just sitting up here telling you what to do, you know, a month later when you're actually writing the postmortem, are you going to remember what I said? And so we have quite a bit of coaching within a postmortem as they're writing it, and within the tools, tool tips, we're constantly reinforcing it. And then because there are so many eyes on the postmortem, it's kind of a reinforcing process, right? So if I see something where someone said, oh, this was caused by a binary push, and I say, I just looked through the timeline and it actually looks like this config file is what enabled that to happen in production, I'll just make a comment, right? And so that's one of the strengths, I think, of Google's postmortem culture is it's very communal. Everyone's reading everyone else's postmortems. There's no really hiding things from each other. So there's sort of this peer group enforcement. then when it comes to the data, so what I've seen actually is, so I've presented certain reports to senior management, and if something looks fishy, they're going to notice. And they're going to ask, okay, why does this look bad? And I may have to say, like, well, garbage in, garbage out, right? And then I have to use the hammer, right? So, any other questions? All right, great, thanks.